Okay folks, today we're going to talk about sandpaper. A little bit different than the stuff in the wood shop. The abrasive that is used on this is a heavier duty abrasive used to sand metal. So if we try to use regular sandpaper from the wood shop, the product that's on that is called garnet, which is very similar to sand. The stuff on here is usually aluminum oxide, a product like that, and that's what it is. Other variations of it. Now, a couple different things about sandpaper grits. We did have the video on that. We talked about that a little bit, but to kind of show you what they look like. So, on the back of my sandpaper, there's usually a number, okay? And that number specifies what the grit of the sandpaper is. So, for instance, this says P150. That is 150 grit sandpaper. That means there are 150 pieces of abrasive in 1 square inch of this abrasive paper. Okay, so that's what it stands for. So normally what we do is we would sand with 150 grit sandpaper, and that's going to get all the large scratches out, machine marks and things like that, and it's going to put scratches in there that match that 150 grit. Then once all those marks are out and the entire surface looks identical to itself with the 150 grit sandpaper, we would then take and go to the 220 grit sandpaper. 220 pieces of abrasive to that 1 square inch. Now you can clearly feel and see, we can see the difference of the color of the abrasive. One's a darker yellow, one's a lighter yellow. But if you run your finger across here, you can feel the difference on that abrasive. Okay, so we would take that 220 grit sandpaper, sand all the way through. Then we would go to 320 grit sandpaper. Okay, that's the next one we carry here in the shop, and that feels much smoother yet. Continuing on from there, once we get all the 320 grit scratches in and out of it, we would go to our 400 grit sandpaper, and this feels very smooth. So we would 400 grit the entire thing, and here's, once we get past 400, we start to look at some polishing techniques. So we would go 400, and we would use that sandpaper dry. Then what we would do was take this sandpaper, we would wet it down, and we would wet sand our project with 400 grit sandpaper. That water is going to act like a lubricant, and it is going to put finer scratches into that piece of material that we're sanding. Okay. Once we would finish with the 400, you can go 500 grit. Sometimes you can also skip right to 600. So this black sandpaper is also a wet, dry sandpaper, and this is 600 grit. You can see the number on there, 600, and that's what we would use. So we would go 600 dry first, and then we would wet the sandpaper and go 600 wet. At that point, you really start to see the shine coming out of the material. After this step, we would take and buff the project with probably a red buffing compound first, then a green second, and a blue third. We could usually skip the red depending on how we sand. If we sand very well, we can usually skip the red rouge compound, that's called, and we could go right to the green, and that's specifically for aluminum. That last one we said is blue. It's a high shine compound. It's meant to give the object some depth. So when we go to sand anything for this process, we're going to show you this meat tenderizer head. Now, we took and machined this very finely on the milling machine. We put a cutting oil on it on the last pass. This is fairly smooth. So the 150 grit sandpaper, it might be overkill, but we're going to run it through it anyhow so you can see what it looks like. So my suggestion when we get to sand something like this is flat. Lay our sandpaper flat on the workbench or the work table. We're going to take our material and then lay it on here, and we're going to move this back and forth. So for 2 reasons. First off, we want to keep this material flat and square. I'm working on a flat, perfectly flat steel table, so that's not going to round any corners or edges over. It's going to keep our size correct. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to hold my sandpaper down with one hand, take the meat tenderizer head with the other, and we're going to start to take this back and forth. Okay. So you can see the sandpaper starting to get some dark marks in it. My material is starting to get some streaks in it, and we are starting to take those machine marks out. Okay, I'm going to continue to sand this side here from the top of the video, and we'll show you what it looks like once all the machine marks are out. Okay, just want to touch base here. So I've been sanding here for just a couple minutes, and you can see that that surface is, well, it sort of has a shine to it. You can see there's just a couple machine marks left here on this bottom corner. So we'll take and address those and make it look similar. I haven't sanded the other sides yet. If I take a look, I rotate that, you can still see the machine marks. So we're going to sand this thing 150 all the way around, finish it up, and then we'll show what the 220 looks like. So we're sanded to 150. Machine marks are out all the way around, all sides. So we get the zoom here. Okay, the next step, we're going to move to 220 grit sandpaper. Now, as we continue to sand, you're going to take those filings and the debris that comes off and dump that off the sandpaper, and that way it's not working against us as we continue. So just like we did before, light pressure, flat against the table, nice and easy. Okay, you really shouldn't be wearing through sandpaper. Like this piece of 150 grit, I folded it once, but it's still in good shape. Most of the time when I give you sandpaper for a project, you should be able to complete most of the project with the sandpaper I give you, rather than fishing sandpaper out of the tool cupboard and so on and so forth. It's easier for me just to give you a piece and roll with that. So the 220 is not going to take very long because we took most of our big scratches out with our 150 grit sandpaper. So you can see how there's some filings on here real quick. Okay, and it comes back off and our sandpaper's clean. So just keep an eye on that. Continue to do that as you sand, and that's going to save you a lot of time here in the future. We'll rotate to the next side. If you take and put more time in at the beginning, this will turn out nicer at the end. One thing we can't do is skip grits. So if I go from 150 grit right to 600, you will see every single mark in that material. So it's easier, like I said, just to follow the steps and run through it. Okay, as I said, it goes quicker actually as you continue to go through the grits. As I said, if you put the time in at the beginning, it's going to save you some time here at the end also. So we'll continue with our 220 grit. Like I said, don't forget to keep dumping out that sandpaper, get the filings out of there. At this point, you should have no machine marks whatsoever. Sometimes you get a slight mark that still stays in there, you don't totally get out. You know, they should all be out of there at this stage of the game. So we want to start getting the shine out of this thing and get it as smooth as possible, really. So I'll finish up with the 220 grit sandpaper. We'll see you here in just a minute for the 320. Okay, starting in the 320. You can see that we are starting to get some shine out of the project here. Really can't see the sanding marks. Let's say the 320 will definitely start to bring more shine out. And as I said, continue to make those smaller scratches. Eventually the scratches will be so small you won't be able to see them. And that's kind of the name of the game here. So see if we can tell a little bit of a difference here. So if I go 320, and here's where we left off with the 220. Looks similar. You probably can't really see the lines on the camera, but they are definitely getting shorter and smaller here. So we'll continue with the 300 and we'll see with the 400. Okay, going into the 400 grit sandpaper, you can see that we're really coming to a shine now. Okay, no machine marks, no scratches. Just the same as we've done before. Now, as I get to the higher grits of sandpaper, I'm going to start to take my work and I'm going to kind of spin out a little bit of a circle or go in a circular motion as I sand that. Metal is not directional. It's not like a wood shop or wood tech. When you sand, you have to sand with the grain. Metal doesn't have a grain per se on a finish end of things. There is grains in ferrous metals, but that's one other topic. I don't want to get sidetracked here, but we can start to go in a circular motion and really start to see that shine come out. So we're going to continue with the 400 grit sandpaper here. As always, continue to take that sandpaper, clean it out so it's not loaded up, and we'll continue from there. Okay, we'll see you folks in just a minute. We'll probably take, once we get our 400 pretty much wrapped up here, we're going to wet the sandpaper down, do the wet sand with 400, and then we will go to our 6. Okay, we're going to move into the wet sanding now. So I took my sandpaper and I wet it. I'm also going to take my workpiece. We're going to move it around a little bit just to make sure the work is wet. And we're going to continue to sand just like we previously did. Okay? You'll notice the material almost has like a suction cup feel to it. and it's going to pull down against that sandpaper well. Okay. Now this part's kind of difficult because it's kind of hard to tell because that water is filling in if there are any grooves left in your project. But you will definitely be able to tell that it feels much smoother after you take a look at it. So I'm going to go ahead and sand this. We'll dry it off. We'll show you what it looks like. And we'll move to the 600. 600 dry, 600 wet, and then we'll go to the buffer. Okay, we did our 400. And like I said, we're bringing the shine out. We're going to start with our 600 dry, go 600 wet, and we'll show you what this looks like right before we go to buff it. Okay? Once again, circular motion. And this should do very well for us. We had a very good casting. We took our time through the process of sanding, so we should have fairly good results here once we get wrapped up with this. Okay, at this stage of the game, we're now ready to buff. So we're going to start with the green buffing compound. Okay, you see our project here, very smooth, has a shine to it as goes by the light. But we're going to take and make this a high shine. So we're going to use the green compound. We're going to put this on the right wheel first. Apply the compound with the right. Remove the compound with the left. Once we're done with that, we're going to head back to the fast buffer in the back of the shop. We're going to use our blue compound, which is a high shine, and go from there. So power on, a little bit of buffing compound. You don't have to be crazy with it. Stand to the side when you put that on so you don't get covered in it. Okay, we're going to buff the low side of the project and then rotate to the opposite side. Okay, light pressure. You don't want to push too hard. If you start to push too hard, you know, it's going to cause friction. This thing's going to get extremely hot really fast, and we don't want to do that. So you can see I'm starting to put the compound on there. Okay, we'll rotate to our other side, do just the same. And that compound is actually cutting. There's a very fine abrasive inside of that. Even though it looks like a waxy type of product, there's an abrasive in there, and it is cutting as we're applying pressure. Okay, so we'll come to our clean side now, and we'll start to remove that compound. Ran into a little problem here. This compound had some excess, or the wheel had some excess compound on it, so it's loaded up. What we can do is take a dry paper towel, and that compound will come off of there manually. Okay, went on to buffer. So I'm gonna have to clean this wheel off. In order to clean the wheel, we'll do it live right now while you're sitting here watching. We're gonna take a hacksaw. Okay, we're going to lay one side down against the table. We're going to take the other side of our hacksaw blade and hold that against the wheel. And that is going to strip that wheel down. See the amount of junk that's coming off of there? Okay, most of that's excess compound. It takes and cuts down on the diameter of the wheel a little bit, makes it smaller. Yeah, that'll help us. Okay, so let's put our compound back on, nice and light. So we don't need a whole lot of it, and we'll continue to buff. Okay, rotate. Okay, we'll come over to our clean wheel. Okay, we'll continue to buff, and we'll be back in just a minute. Okay, last leg of the buffing, we're going to come back to the buffer in the back of the shop. It's much faster. We're also going to use a blue buffing compound. Okay, a little bit different than the green stuff we used. And I believe this is called Ultra Bright. So that is really going to pull the color out of this thing. So we'll put a little compound on our work, and we'll start the buff. So you can see the green compound, what it did. Okay, and now we'll move here to the blue. And you can definitely tell the difference of the blue compound. It's almost like a mirror to the green, okay? Not putting any more pressure on it. That's actually the compound itself doing the work. Now, the blue compound is much softer. You're going to eat through a lot of blue compound compared to the green, but that's fine. We're not concerned about that. And you can see we have here, we'll take dry paper towel and just wipe it across here a few times. And you'll see the depth of the shine there as it continues. So we'll buff a little bit more on here, and we'll come back in just a minute. So very last, we finished up with our blue buffing compound. You can see, almost see in the mirror, as a mirror. Okay, so this is going to be food grade. Ideally, once this thing is complete, what you want to do is take this home, soak it in some Dawn dish soap, disassemble it, unscrew it, let this thing sit maybe a half hour or something like that in soap and water. I wouldn't use a Brillo pad or something like that, but just a regular wash rag. You can clean this thing out, and then you're ready to rock and roll. Okay, so that is the meat tenderizer project, and it's a pretty interesting project. The reason I say that is we go from molten aluminum. We started from nothing, and we ended up with something. So between the machine shop processes, squaring the head, well, first off doing the foundry, ramming up a mold, pouring the foundry off, casting it, cutting it apart, doing rough milling on the milling machine, fine milling, cutting the grooves, drilling and tapping, and then just like we did with our handle, we did a turning cut, we knurled it, we did more turning cuts, we tapered it, we threaded it. Very large-scale project here. Definitely something to be proud of once it's all said and done and finished. And here's our completed threads, which we showed you before. Did all the demos for those. So that is the end of it.